You've been talking lots about critical speed and critical power. Maybe you better define that for us. And then maybe you can also move on to allude to I know you've done a study fairly recently where you kind of compared laboratory measures of maximal lactate steady state and the critical speed. And I think the field stuff might have come out even better. So talk us through that story if you can.
Yeah, well, so critical speed is not, in a sense, a physiological measure. It's a mechanical or performance-based thing. So essentially, what you need is a range of different. You either run at a variety of different speeds for as long as you can. So you've got a fixed speed, and you simply got a stopwatch, and you run at that speed for as long as you can. And then when you can't sustain that speed, you stop the watch. So you've got 3 or 4 of those. Alternatively, you could have a range of different distances, and you try to cover that distance as quickly as you can. Now, the important thing, though, is that this critical speed relationship, it has to be in what we call the severe domain. So it's in that range of durations where your VO2 max will be hit. So essentially, the shortest duration run that you do has to be at least 2 minutes, maybe 2 to 3 minutes, and the longest probably somewhere between 12 and 15. So if you could get a range of speeds or distances where the time to exhaustion or the time to complete was, say, 2.5 minutes, 5 minutes, 8 minutes, 13 minutes. So then you've got 4 speeds and times and speeds that falls within that range where VO2 max is going to be hit by the end. So you've got a slow component or whatever. But if it's any shorter than that, the relationship doesn't really hold so well. And if it's any longer than that, then it doesn't either. But essentially, what you end up with then, if you plot speed against time, you'll end up with this sort of curvy, linear, hyperbolic shape. And where that curve levels off is your critical speed. And the shape of the curve tells you something. We call it the D prime. But it tells you something. I don't like to call it an anaerobic capacity, but it's related to non-oxidative metabolism in some ways. A bit more complicated than that. Not sure we can unpack it in the time available, but so just park that one for now. So that's all based on performance, but it is explained by the physiology. So if you exercise people below their critical speed, as determined, as calculated in the way I've just described, you'll find that they'll be able to actually maintain a steady state VO2. Whereas if you exercise them above that critical speed, they simply can't. And that D prime that you've measured will be used at a particular rate. And when it reaches 0, that's when they become exhausted. So when you combine the critical speed and the D prime, it can really predict performance really, really closely within that 2 to 15 minute range. So between 800 meters and 5K, really. But it's, what we also know is that you can't exercise above your critical speed for particularly long because your VO2 is rising with time. You're drawing upon anaerobic metabolic processes, which are finite and so on. So to run the marathon, you need your critical speed to be as high as possible. And what we find is that the athletes tend to operate just below that. They intuitively know where that critical speed is, and they operate at the top end of what we call the heavy domain, where you can still sustain a metabolic steady state. Lactate, phosphocreatine, oxygen uptake are all stable with time.
So putting it into practical terms for the listener and viewer is how long can someone generally exercise at their critical speed?
Yeah, well, that's I don't think that's the right way to look at it in a way, because what it simply separates are these exercise domains within which VO2 is either steady, and that's not just VO2, but everything else kind of falls in line with it, or isn't steady. So one speed, if you're below critical speed, that is sustainable, and the mechanism of fatigue is going to be different. It could be that you run out of glycogen, let's say that is for now. Whereas when you run above critical speed, it's not steady state, and the mechanisms of fatigue are probably different. We know that when you reach exhaustion in the severe domain, your muscle lactate is very high, your muscle phosphocreatine is very low. There's a whole plethora of kind of metabolic factors that probably contribute to either the decision to terminate exercise or the fact that you can no longer continue physically. So, but if you wanted to push me on that, we did a study. Rebecca Nixon was the first author on it, and we calculated that it's probably around 17 minutes, something like that. I think the thing that's held people back in understanding critical power or critical speed is the notion that it should be sustainable indefinitely. Well, no exercise intensity actually is. So, and we shouldn't be thinking of, if you can only run at critical speed for 17 minutes, then it's not a sustainable intensity. It isn't supposed to be. It simply separates these two domains within which responses are very different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I guess where I'm coming at is that it has similarities to the functional threshold power, like the critical power, say, would have a similar sort of ideas and concepts to the functional threshold power, the FTP, and again, Kogan recommends that we do a 20-minute test, and then we take 5% from that, and this is about your 60-minute one, and then of course that all becomes useful when we're trying to calculate the load of a training program. So I mean, it's in the ballpark, right, in terms of being around that. Maybe a little bit below that is around the hour. You said a little bit below that is around the 2-hour mark as well, right? So, and it's going to vary from person to person depending on their resilience and economy, and probably how fit they are, how much different metabolites are contributing to the energy. So, but didn't you do? And again, where I was kind of going with this initially was, did I read correctly or not that you showed a critical speed being a better predictor of, I guess, a race performance than, say, like a maximal lactate steady state taken in the lab? Didn't you do a study with that, or were you an author on that study?
Probably.
And Andy's, you have to forgive Andy, he's got 360 publications last I read, so probably more now.
we have you can determine critical speed from field-based data. You can certainly do it from personal best performances. You can do it from training data and all of that, and we did find that you get slightly different numbers for critical speed and D prime if you assess those things in the field compared to in the lab. I mean, we also did an analysis which showed that the best marathon runners operated about 96% of their critical speed during their personal best races. Yeah. I'm not sure if that was the same question, really. But I think sort of 10K speed is the sort of thing that separates the heavy from the severe domain, if you want to think of it like that.
Yeah. I mean, well, it's really similar, right? It's in the ballpark of where we anchor the maximal lactate steady state, right? And again, we're always looking to not everyone's got time to go into the lab, or they can afford to go into the lab. So people want to know, well, what can I do practically? And now we've got the GPSs and whatnot, and there's lots of different I guess tricks to be able to get that information. Maybe not as accurately, but within ballpark, and making it kind of practical for the user. I would recommend.
The other thing, a rough rule of thumb, is that the other thing that you could equate it to is the lactate turn point, or the second lactate threshold. So if you do a blood lactate profile in the lab, you start at a slow speed, you get people to run for 3 or 4 minutes. You take the speed up every 3 or 4 minutes by kilometre per hour or so. You find that lactate is pretty flat, very close to resting levels for a few speeds, maybe 1 or so millimolar. Starts to drift a little bit above that baseline. Couple of stages later, and you'll find that there's like a kind of sharp change. We call that the lactate turn point, and that is a rough estimate of both the maximal lactate steady state and the critical speed. They're all interrelated to some extent, and we find that second lactate threshold corresponds generally to 85 to 90% of maximal heart rate.
Yep.
And that doesn't seem to change very much. So in the long period of time during which I've worked with Paula Radcliffe, the speed at that lactate turn point for her, increased massively, but the absolute heart rate at which that occurred at, and the fraction of the maximum, really didn't change very much. So you get simultaneous muscle metabolic and cardiovascular adaptations, which mean that threshold heart rate actually ends up remaining quite similar over time.